I speak in the name of God, whoever creates, redeems, and brings new life. Amen. This past Thursday, August the 6th, was the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima at 8:15 hours. You probably heard and remembered. Yesterday was the anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki. Strong winds, the result of million-degree temperatures and shock waves that emanated from that atomic blast, obliterated human life and a whole city in seconds. 140,000 died there in Hiroshima alone. August 6th has also been, since the 13th century, the Feast of the Transfiguration, as if to highlight the abomination of this event. The Transfiguration foretells the glory of the Lord and his ascension into heaven. Transfiguration anticipates the glory of heaven, where human beings, you and I, shall see God face to face. But it speaks of the present also, that life, as Jesus Christ witnessed and tells us, is lived through grace, and that we already share this divine promise that we are made, all human beings, in the image and likeness of God. So the shocking contrast on this day in Hiroshima between two transfiguration events, one in which the imprint of human beings was left as shadows on walls, and the other holding the promise and intent for these same human beings who were, like us, created in the image of God. Well, today we also face many winds. And I'm hoping that our story will be for us a sense of strength and of hope as we hear the gospel recorded and reported to us again this morning. But these winds in the gospel, strong winds, also produced fear and told a story of failure. But the winds were also winds of hope and grace and of the presence of God. It's a story that ought to have led Western Christians to an alternate path than the one that led to Little Boy, as that bomb was called. Out of these winds on Lake Gennesaret spoke the one who says, in all the winds we might face, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. We might actually read there instead, take heart, I am, do not be afraid. The voice in these winds is none other than the words that were heard at the burning bush in the presence of Moses. The one who revealed, the God who revealed God's name, is here walking on the water, the one who brings life and overcomes death. Now, early Christians read this story in that way, that is, as a story of hope. It inspired them and encouraged them in the midst of the strong winds of that time, in the midst of persecution and opposition, as they read as a very small faith community, this community of lambs they were called, in the presence of a daunting world and impending world events. So there's a whole symbolism here as well within this story. This church that had been buffeted by adversity. Of course, the storytellers of the gospel reminded its folk often and reminds us of these things. For early Christians and many down the century, there was this powerful symbol in the story. People in that time actually feared oceans and waters. The waters and the great deeps were a threat. They were the source of threatening power. The sea was the presence of Leviathan, a dragon-like figure who swirled in the deeps. So here is the one who is named the Lord, walking across the water in this abyss-like ocean, this Sea of Gennesaret, as the winds blew, swirling water around, and here is the one walking towards them, shocking and amazement to the disciples, but at the same time awakening in later years strength and hope in the face of what was around them. Strong winds, weighty issues and concerns name the present time as well. And we will often feel, as I said, disempowered and not quite sure what to do, especially as we're isolated behind masks like today. So let me come to the story from our reading today, to the Gospel of Matthew. In that text, we should note, it says Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. It's actually what the words say there in Greek. It is that he compelled the disciples to get in the boat, almost like he forced them to get into the boat in order to go and to be alone in the crowd. Perhaps the compelling was because he knew that they needed a bit of self-care. The second thing I note from this story is that having faith is not necessarily an easy thing to have. We note that Jesus calls his disciples into the midst of this sea. He doesn't beckon them away from it, from the storm. Instead, he actually calls out coming across to Peter, and he says, "Come." He doesn't say, "Get in your boat and get out of the way, quick." Instead, he says, "Come." So faith is never a simple assertion. Faith is a dynamic practice. And as one commentator, Terry McDowell Ott, wrote in the Christian Century a couple of years ago, faith isn't easy. By its very nature, faith isn't easy. Faith is not something that we can rationalise or explain or even obtain with any measure of success. If we were to attempt to explain it, we might talk about reaching for the unreachable, finite hands grasping for that which is infinite. But faith is the bridge that is built between stark dichotomies. Faith, it is hope in the face of despair. It is love in the face of hatred. It is peace in the face of violence. It is beauty in the face of ugliness. It is justice in the face of injustice. It is courage in the face of fear. So faith is a dynamic, spirited force that moves us from the place where we are to the place where we might be. Now, Peter is often held up as an example to us, but we're not all Peters. We're not all those sorts of people that can just jump out impetuously and take the lead. Nevertheless, he is held up as an example. And often this interaction between Jesus, when Jesus says, "Come," and of course he begins to sink, what Jesus says is often heard as a rebuke. Now, as I thought about this story, I actually said to Penny, I think Jesus must have a smile on his face when he rebukes Peter. And I was really pleased to hear that Suzanne Guthrie thought the same. She says, it is possible that Jesus is playfully asking Peter, "Why did you doubt? You of little faith, you had it." And she writes that Jesus is like a parent here, teaching a child to ride a two-wheel bicycle. Have you done that? I have, with all my kids and my grandkids, and the struggle of that. You let the child go, and he sails off with perfect balance, suddenly looks around and down they go because they realise you're not holding the bike anymore. But the parent who calls out after that happens, "You did it, you were doing it, you can do it." I remember those milestones of praise and encouragement, wonder and pride and celebration, even the bandages and the ice packs over the well-earned wounds off those bikes. But not long after, the child forgets ever learning to ride the bike as she and her friends ride off at dizzying speeds to explore a much expanded world. I think I'd like to see it in that light, this falling of Peter. I'm drawn to this image that this story was written to a gathered community of disciples. It's not denying this reality of what occurred on this lake, but as an event in itself, it doesn't get much strength for us. But if we hear it as an event in our current circumstances, as a word of encouragement to each of us in our own place and in our own life experience, then this becomes something else. Our own battered winds and strong headwinds mean that we can also, like Peter, hear the call of Jesus in the midst of these winds and actually begin stepping out like those children on the bicycle, and not to hear rebuke in words of meanness and punitiveness, but in words of joy and saying, come on, you can do it, you can do this,